Welcome to a deep dive into the world of mechanical ventilation. I feel like it can be a whole new language, but we're going to break down the most important parts based on the notes and research you've shared with us. We're going to look at all those different modes, how they actually work, and why one might be chosen over another.
Yeah, it's a bit like having a toolbox, right? With all these different tools, and each one designed for a very specific purpose.
Ooh, I like that analogy. So by the end of this, you'll be able to navigate all those tools with a lot more confidence. Now, before we jump into those specific modes, let's lay some groundwork here. Can you tell us a bit about the core concepts that govern how these machines work?
Absolutely. The key is understanding how a ventilator controls the breath cycle. And it all comes down to three variables: trigger, limit, and cycle.
Trigger, limit, cycle. Okay, let's unpack those a bit.
So think of the trigger variable as the starting pistol. It's what initiates a breath. This could be the patient's own effort to breathe, or it could be a timer on the ventilator.
So the machine can essentially step in and breathe for the patient if they need it.
Exactly. Now, the limit variable, this acts as a safety net. It sets a maximum value for either pressure or volume during inhalation, preventing the lungs from being overinflated.
Makes sense. Safety first. What about the cycle variable?
Well, that's what signals the end of the inhalation phase. It tells the ventilator when to stop delivering air and switch to exhalation. And like the trigger, the cycle can be initiated by the patient or by a time setting on the ventilator.
Okay, I think I'm getting this. Trigger starts the breath, limit keeps things safe, and cycle tells the machine when to switch to exhale.
You got it. Now, where things get really interesting is how these variables are manipulated in different ventilator modes.
Let's dive into those modes. One that comes up often in your research is controlled ventilation. It sounds a bit, well, controlling.
It is. In this mode, the ventilator is calling all the shots. It delivers a preset volume of air, called the tidal volume, at a predetermined rate. The patient doesn't have any control over their breathing.
That sounds like it would be used in very specific situations.
Yes, controlled ventilation is typically reserved for cases where complete rest is necessary, such as during certain surgeries when someone is having a seizure, or in cases of unstable chest injuries where even the slightest movement could be detrimental.
So are there any downsides to taking away that much control from the patient?
There can be. For many, being on controlled ventilation is a very uncomfortable experience. It can feel like you're fighting against the machine, which increases the work of breathing. So in addition to the conditions we already talked about, a patient on controlled ventilation often needs sedation, and in some cases even paralysis, to ensure they're comfortable and not fighting the ventilator.
That makes sense. From a clinical perspective, if you're going to completely take over someone's breathing, you want to make sure it's not creating more distress. So controlled ventilation is a pretty heavy-duty intervention.
It is. But what's fascinating is that even though it's not ideal, it's sometimes absolutely necessary to give the body a chance to heal.
I can see that. Now, what about situations where the patient is able to contribute to their breathing but still needs some assistance? I know there are modes that address that, right?
Yes, there are. Those modes tend to be used more frequently, and that's where things get a little more nuanced. One of the most common is assist control ventilation, or ACV.
Assist control. I like that. Sounds less, well, forceful than controlled ventilation.
It is more collaborative. In ACV, the ventilator still delivers breaths at a set rate, but it also allows the patient to trigger breaths on their own. So you have a combination of time-triggered and patient-triggered breaths.
So if the patient makes an effort to breathe, the ventilator sort of jumps in and helps them along?
Exactly. The ventilator gives them that extra boost to reduce their work of breathing. This can be really helpful for patients who are weak or fatigued.
It's like having a backup singer for your lungs.
That's a great way to put it.
But even with that assistance, I imagine there's still a delicate balance to strike.
You're right. One of the potential downsides of ACV is the risk of hyperventilation, especially in patients who have a central nervous system injury. They might trigger the ventilator too often. This can lead to a decrease in carbon dioxide levels in the blood.
So it's like they're getting too much of a good thing, the ventilator's helping, but they're maybe overdoing it a bit.
Precisely. And this highlights the importance of close monitoring with all of these modes.
Now, I'm also seeing in your notes a mode called intermittent mandatory ventilation, or IMV. What's that all about?
IMV is a step further down the road of giving the patient more control over their breathing. It's what we call a mode of partial ventilatory support.
Partial support, meaning the patient is doing more of the work.
Right. Think of it this way. With controlled ventilation, the patient's like a passenger in a car. With IMV, they're starting to get behind the wheel. The ventilator still delivers mandatory breaths at set intervals, just like controlled ventilation. But it allows the patient to breathe spontaneously in between those breaths.
That sounds like a good way to help patients regain their strength and prepare to come off the ventilator entirely.
It is. Maintaining respiratory muscle strength is critical for weaning from mechanical ventilation. But there's a potential complication with IMV called breath stacking.
Breath stacking? That sounds uncomfortable.
It can be. Imagine this. The patient takes a spontaneous breath, and just as they're finishing, it's time for the ventilator to deliver its mandatory breath. Those two breaths can overlap, which is what we call breath stacking.
So it's like the two breaths are colliding.
Yes. And that can lead to higher pressures in the lungs, potentially causing damage to the lung tissue. It's definitely something we want to avoid.
I can see why. So how do clinicians navigate that potential problem? Is there a way to avoid breath stacking?
There is. And that brings us to an even more sophisticated mode. Synchronized intermittent mandatory ventilation, or SIMV.
Okay, SIMV, synchronized. So it's more in tune with the patient's breathing.
Exactly. SIMV is like IMV, but with better timing. Instead of delivering those mandatory breaths at set intervals no matter what, SIMV tries to sync up with the patient's own efforts. It's all about working with the patient, not against them.
That sounds like a major improvement, but how does it actually work? How does the ventilator know when the patient is trying to breathe?
So, SIMV ventilators have what's called a synchronization window. It's a very brief period, usually just a fraction of a second, where the ventilator becomes incredibly sensitive to any sign that the patient's trying to initiate a breath.
So it's like the ventilator is on high alert waiting for a signal from the patient.
That's a great way to think about it. And if the patient makes an effort to breathe within that window, the ventilator delivers its mandatory breath in sync with the patient's effort. It's a pretty remarkable feat of engineering.
It really is. It sounds like SIMV really takes the guesswork out of coordinating breaths, which must make a big difference for both the patient and the clinical team.
Absolutely. Avoiding breath stacking is a huge win for patient comfort and safety. And for clinicians, it provides a more controlled environment for weaning.
Weaning seems to be the ultimate goal with a lot of these modes.
It is. The goal is always to get the patient breathing independently again as safely and as quickly as possible. And SIMV, with its ability to reduce the work of breathing while still allowing for spontaneous breaths, is often a key player in that process. But like you said before, there's a delicate balance to strike. Weaning too quickly can lead to fatigue and ultimately set the patient back.
So it's not just about choosing the right mode, it's about making careful adjustments along the way. What are some of the things clinicians are looking for when they're making those decisions?
Well, we're constantly monitoring the patient's vital signs, of course, but we're also paying close attention to their respiratory effort. How hard are they working to breathe? Are they using their accessory muscle? What's their breathing pattern like? All of those factors play a role in determining when and how to adjust the ventilator settings.
So it's a very individualized process tailored to each patient's needs and progress.
Exactly. There's no one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to mechanical ventilation. Now, I know we've been focusing a lot on modes that primarily control the volume of air delivered, but there's another category of modes that you've been researching. Pressure-controlled ventilation.
Yes. I'm curious to hear more about how that differs.
So instead of setting a specific tidal volume with pressure-controlled ventilation, we set a target pressure that the ventilator will deliver. This allows the volume of air delivered to vary depending on the patient's lung compliance.
Lung compliance. I'm not familiar with that term.
It's essentially how easily the lungs inflate. Think of it like a balloon. A stiff balloon has low compliance. It takes more effort to inflate it. On the other hand, a balloon that inflates easily has high compliance.
Okay, that makes sense. So with pressure control, the volume of air delivered might change from breath to breath depending on how much resistance the lungs are giving.
Exactly. It allows the ventilator to adapt to the patient's lung characteristics, which can be incredibly beneficial, especially in certain clinical situations.
What kinds of situations would that be?
One of the most common scenarios where pressure control really shines is in patients with ARDS, or acute respiratory distress syndrome.
That sounds serious.
It is. ARDS causes the lungs to become stiff and difficult to inflate, kind of like that stiff balloon we were talking about. With volume-controlled modes, you run the risk of overinflating the lungs, which can actually worsen the injury. Pressure control helps to avoid that by limiting the peak pressures delivered to the lungs.
So it's a more protective approach, especially for lungs that are already compromised.
Exactly. Now, within pressure control, there are different modes, just like with volume control. One of the most common is pressure support ventilation, or PSV.
Pressure support.
Mm.
So it's not taking over breathing entirely like controlled ventilation.
Right. PSV is designed to work with the patient's own spontaneous breaths. It applies a set pressure to their airway, giving them a little extra oomph with each inhalation. It's a very collaborative approach.
Like giving their own breathing a gentle nudge in the right direction.
I like that. And because it works in tandem with the patient's efforts, PSV is often used to help facilitate weaning from the ventilator.
Weaning keeps coming up. It really does seem like the ultimate goal for most patients on mechanical ventilation.
It is. We want to get them back to breathing on their own as soon as it's safe to do so. And PSV can be a valuable tool in that process. It reduces the work of breathing, which can be especially important for patients who have an artificial airway in place.
An artificial airway.
Things like endotracheal tubes or tracheostomy tubes, those tubes can create resistance in the airway, making it harder for the patient to breathe. PSV helps them overcome that resistance, making each breath a little bit easier.
So PSV is like taking some of the weight off their shoulders, so to speak.
Exactly. It allows them to rest and conserve energy while still actively participating in their breathing. This is why PSV is often used in conjunction with SIMV.
I'm starting to see how all these modes can work together, almost like a stepwise progression as the patient gets stronger.
That's a great observation. You might start with a more controlled mode like ACV, then transition to SIMV as the patient becomes more able to initiate breaths on their own, and then add in pressure support to help them along as they continue to improve.
It's like a carefully choreographed dance between the patient, the ventilator, and the clinical team. Now, you mentioned earlier a mode called CPAP. I know people use CPAP machines at home for sleep apnea. Does that have a role in this whole ventilator picture as well?
It does. CPAP, which stands for continuous positive airway pressure, is considered a spontaneous breathing mode. It provides a constant level of pressure to the airways, but it doesn't deliver any preset breaths. The patient does all the work of breathing.
So it's less about controlling the breath and more about keeping the airways open and stable.
You've got it. It's like a gentle splint for the airways. And it's particularly useful for patients who are having trouble maintaining healthy oxygen levels in their blood due to problems with gas exchange in their lungs.
Gas exchange, that's the process of oxygen getting into the blood and carbon dioxide getting out. Right?
Exactly. And sometimes that process gets disrupted. For example, if there's something called shunting happening in the lungs, it's when blood bypasses areas of the lungs that are responsible for gas exchange.
So the blood isn't picking up as much oxygen as it should be.
Right. CPAP helps to counteract that by increasing the pressure in the alveoli, those tiny air sacs in the lungs where gas exchange takes place. This helps to improve oxygenation and get those levels back where they need to be.
So unlike some of the other modes we've talked about, CPAP isn't really about helping with the mechanics of breathing, but more about ensuring adequate oxygen levels.
You've hit the nail on the head, and it can be an incredibly effective tool both in the hospital and for patients at home who need ongoing respiratory support.
This is all so fascinating. We've covered so much ground, from trigger variables to breath stacking to pressure support, and now CPAP. I feel like I'm actually starting to understand how these ventilators work.
That's great to hear. It's a complex field, but once you grasp the basic principles, it all starts to make sense.
It really does. It feels like we've journeyed through the entire world of mechanical ventilation.
Well, we've covered a lot, but there's always more to explore. Remember, this is just a glimpse into the world of mechanical ventilation. There are countless variations, nuances, and advanced features that we haven't even touched on.
Is there anything in particular you think would be helpful to cover before we wrap up? Anything that stands out as particularly important or cutting edge in the field right now?
Well, there's one area that's incredibly exciting and has the potential to revolutionize the way we approach mechanical ventilation. Closed-loop ventilation. It's a relatively new development, but it's already generating a lot of buzz in the respiratory care community.
Closed-loop ventilation. That sounds intriguing.
It is. Imagine a ventilator that can not only monitor a patient's breathing, but also automatically adjust its own settings in real time based on the patient's needs. That's essentially what closed-loop ventilation aims to do.
Wow. That sounds incredibly futuristic. It's like the ventilator is making decisions on its own.
In a way, yes. It's all about taking some of the guesswork out of ventilator management. We're still in the early stages of development, but the potential benefits are huge.
Okay, closed-loop ventilation. Definitely something to keep an eye on. I have to say, this deep dive has given me a whole new appreciation for the complexity and importance of respiratory care.
I'm glad to hear that. It's a field that often gets overlooked, but it plays such a critical role in patient care.
Well, based on all this incredible information, I feel like I'm well on my way to becoming a ventilator expert. Welcome back to our deep dive into the world of ventilator modes.
It has been quite a journey.
It really has. We've gone from those fundamental concepts of trigger, limit, and cycle, all the way to that cutting-edge world of closed-loop ventilation. It's incredible how much ground we've covered.
Yeah, it's a testament to how rapidly the field of mechanical ventilation is advancing.
I'm curious, what are some of the key factors that are driving all that innovation?
Well, there are several forces at play. One is that ongoing quest to improve patient outcomes. We're constantly searching for ways to make ventilation safer, more comfortable, and more effective at helping patients recover.
That makes sense. No one wants to be on a ventilator any longer than they absolutely have to.
Exactly. Another major driver is the integration of technology. We're seeing more and more sophisticated algorithms, sensors, and monitoring systems being incorporated into ventilators.
So it's not just about the hardware itself, but also the software and data analysis that goes along with it.
Precisely. And that data analysis is becoming increasingly crucial. It allows us to track trends, identify potential problems early on, and personalize ventilator settings to each patient's unique needs.
It sounds like we're moving towards an era of truly individualized respiratory care.
I believe we are, and that's incredibly exciting. It means we can tailor treatment to each patient, maximizing their chances of a successful recovery.
I'm also wondering about the role of research in all of this. Are there any particular areas of study that are shaping the future of mechanical ventilation?
There's a lot of fascinating research happening right now. One area that's particularly promising is the study of lung protective strategies. It's all about minimizing the potential damage that ventilation itself can cause to the lungs.
That seems counterintuitive. I thought the whole point of ventilation was to help the lungs.
It is, but the act of mechanically inflating the lungs can sometimes put stress on those delicate tissues. Lung protective strategies aim to minimize that stress by using lower tidal volumes, adjusting pressure settings carefully, and even using alternative modes like pressure control ventilation when appropriate.
So it's about finding that sweet spot between providing enough support to breathe, but not overdoing it to the point of causing harm.
Exactly, the delicate balancing act. And that's why research in this area is so crucial. It's helping us refine our techniques and develop protocols that promote both effective ventilation and lung protection.
This deep dive has given me a whole new appreciation for the complexity of respiratory care. It's not just about hooking someone up to a machine, it's about understanding the nuances of each mode, making informed decisions based on the patient's individual needs, and constantly seeking out ways to improve our practice.
Well said. It's a field that demands both technical expertise and a deep understanding of human physiology. And it's a field that's constantly evolving.
I'm definitely walking away from this conversation feeling inspired to learn more. Any final words of wisdom for those of us who are just beginning to explore this fascinating world?
Embrace the challenge. Never stop asking questions. And always remember that at the heart of respiratory care is the patient. Our ultimate goal is to help them breathe easier, recover faster, and live fuller lives.
Beautifully put. Thank you for sharing your expertise and insights with us today. It's been an incredible journey through the world of mechanical ventilation.
It's been my pleasure.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you've gained a newfound appreciation for the life-saving power of respiratory care. Until next time, keep breathing deeply and keep exploring the world around you.